Welcome everyone. Really nice to see you here. We are going to be doing a panel discussion here. I'm very conscious that some of you might be a little bit groggy after last night, so it won't be death by PowerPoint, but we are going to have a conversation about what I think is a really important topic, which is around how publishers can help with the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I hope is that by the end of this session, you'll have some further ideas about either how to develop your publishing program or to start one from scratch. So I'm conscious that some of you may not be that aware of the SDGs, so I just want to give a little bit of background before we start and explain why they're important and a little bit about the history. So in many ways, it kicked off with the Millennium Development Goals, which ran from 2000 to 2015, and there was an interesting paper produced by some researchers from the Brookings Institution looking at how journals had responded to the Millennium Development Goals. And in many ways, the way that journals and newspapers covered the MDGs was fairly limited back then for between 20 and 2015, with The Lancet in particular being the main journal that had covered the MDGs. Now, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were signed up by, I think, 193 United Nations members, run from 2015 through to 2030. And although they are absolutely imperfect, there's lots that's wrong about them. They are a very important way for global society to try and move forward towards tackling some of its biggest challenges. And I think what you see if you have a look at how publishers are responding to the SDGs compared to the MDGs, there's so much more activity now than there was 15 years ago. So many of you will know about the Sdg Publishers Compact, which has 16 action items for publishers who sign up to it. And one of those action items is around measuring progress that the publishers make towards the SDGs. And we've got a session this afternoon all about measuring impact. So those of you that already have an SDG program, please do think about coming along to that this afternoon. In terms of this morning, the plan is, as I said, to have a panel discussion. We have a slight change of membership of the speaker panel. So unfortunately, Tony Roche from Emerald tested positive for COVID a few days ago. So Claire, one of his colleagues, has very kindly stepped in to join us. Now, some of the speakers have an interest in particular around SDG 6, which is around water and sanitation, and we might pick up on some of the themes around SDG 6, but we're not absolutely going to be focusing just on water and sanitation. We're going to be talking much more broadly about the SDGs and maybe using SDG 6 as an example of how you might be able to use the SDGs to inspire your publishing program. So we're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so between us, and then we'll have some questions at the end. As there was yesterday in the OA book session, there is an app, and you can put questions into the app, and I will either pull them out during the session or maybe use them at the end, and we can have a traditional Q&A with people putting their hands up at the end of our conversation. So let's start off by introducing you to the speaker panel, and I'm going to ask them to do it rather than me read out biographies. So maybe, who have we got over on the right? Fabio over there. Could you just explain to everyone who you are, where you work, and I would also be interested in how you first heard about the SDGs. What's your background? What's your history with the SDGs?
Thanks. So I'm Fabio Pulizzi. I work for Springer Nature, and I'm chief editor for Nature Water, which is a journal that is going to launch in January. I've been there for 16 years. I'm actually a solid-state physicist by training, so I've been doing experiments in optics lab for a long part of my life. Then I joined Nature Nature Materials in 2006. From there, I went to Nature Nanotechnology, and I was there for 10 years. I started doing, I kept working on condensed matter physics until I got a little bit more interested in environmental issues, and in that case, nanotechnology related environmental issues. And I think it's actually by talking to James when he was still there that I started really getting interested in SDGs. And I still remember one conversation we had in which he was actually talking about how the Lancet took on almost as a mission to being interested in the Millennium Goals. And that's my first approach to it. I mean, I was interested in the challenges related particularly to water, but that probably it's really what pushed me to develop this interest, and that's when I actually started thinking about a journal that wouldn't necessarily be only a journal about SDG 6, but that had the themes that are considered into the SDGs, as a central part of the scope of the journal. I think that's
perfect. Thank you very much, Fabio. Julia.
Hello, everybody. I am Julia Martin-Ortega. I am Professor of Ecological Economics at the University of Leeds, and I feel I'm a little bit like the odd one out here in a room full of publishers and editors. I'm neither of those. I'm actually a full-time academic. But I was invited to this panel, for which I'm very grateful, by Fabio, because he thought that maybe I could bring this sort of the other side of the table perspective, and which is very exciting for me. I hope I'm not going to say very naive things that you already know very well. But anyway, going back to the topic of today, my own specialization in ecological economics has to do with trying to couple the biophysical understanding of how ecosystems work and they change and they get degraded or we can restore them, and how that impacts on human well-being and human welfare, and how we can incorporate that couple understanding into policy and decision-making that is actually going to have a positive impact for society. So that very strongly aligns with the idea of the underpinning science, the underpinning interdisciplinary science that connects to addressing the SDGs. Although I do not work just on the SDGs. For me, the SDGs are a political instrument that we use to have these conversations. But that underpinning science, interdisciplinary science between natural and social sciences, derive to that. But also my other hat, which I think is also why maybe Fabio thought I could participate in this panel, is my role as Associate Director of Water at Leeds. Water at Leeds is an interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Leeds, which essentially encompasses anybody who is working on something related to water at the university. And we have from, I was saying to yesterday at the dinner, from people working on hardcore modeling for, flooding prevention, for example, to actually people in the English department working on poetry around water and what does that mean for today's society. Now, so we are, in our website, it says that we are the largest interdisciplinary research hub of any university in the world. I haven't checked, but we're pretty big, and we are, as I said, very, very broad-ranging. And that means that we really try to, besides what each of our individual members do at the Water at Leeds management team, we really try to come together into trying to address these complex socio-ecological issues around water. And on that, one of the activities that we did very recently on that remit was to a scoping exercise across the entire world, across water professionals, asking them what are the top 100 questions that need addressing from a water global challenges around the SDG 6, although not only, but importantly framing around SDGs. And so that kind of a scoping exercise, saying what are the next things that the science needs to answer to, and hopefully we'll get through getting published through people like you. So yeah, a bit long.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. I know many of you, but for those who don't know me, I'm Suzanne Farley. I came out of a PhD in plant physiology a very long time ago, straight into publishing, entry-level editorial at Nature Publishing Group. I was at Nature Publishing Group, which became Springer Nature for many years, in the Nature Reviews department, at Scientific Reports. Most recently, I was Director of Research Integrity at Springer Nature, and about a year ago, I moved to PLOS as Editorial Director, so responsible for all things editorial at PLOS, the Public Library of Science. How I first interacted with the SDGs, James, I think you're responsible again here.
That wasn't a loaded question. I wasn't expecting that answer.
James was instrumental in when things started happening around the SDGs at Springer Nature, and I think you actually interviewed me for a job that was SDG specific, and I didn't get that job, James, but anyway, moving right along. One thing that really struck me when that work started happening at Springer Nature was the enthusiasm that came from across the company, from so many different employees that were excited about the prospect of using their spare time, which of course none of us have any of, to do something on the SDGs. So I think it has convening power on lots of levels, not least of which is kind of inspiring staff to do their thing with even more enthusiasm during their day jobs.
Super, thank you. And Claire, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Claire Jackson. I'm Head of Community Engagement at Emerald Publishing, and I'm an SDG Publishers Compact Fellow, and I'm happy in this session to talk a little bit more about what that is if there's time. For anybody who isn't as familiar with Emerald, we were founded in 1967 by a group of management scholars. So they were researchers, really, who were leading executive programs, as well as providing consultancy to businesses. And that was really placing research that supported decision-making in the workplace really central to the publishing program right from the off. So we have a legacy, I guess, in this area, that kind of focus on research that's driving changes in society. That's kind of been underpinned by a few activities. In 2018, we launched our Real Impact Strategy and Manifesto, which is all about working with our communities to support a fairer, more equitable environment where research can have that real-world impact. Actions we took to support that I know many people in this room will have done as well, included things like signing DORA in 2019. We were one of the first initial signatories to the SDG Publisher Compact. And in 2022, bit of a plug, we launched our Are You In campaign, which is a call really for deeper sector-wide collaboration across multiple stakeholders in the research and scholarly communications world. So I think what the SDG focus means for Emerald is that we are really looking to grow our commissioning program aligned to a number of the SDGs. I should say up front that we are not, as a social sciences publisher, an expert in the SDG 6 space, although there's a lot of intersections, obviously, across all of the SDGs. One of the things we did coming up to 2 years ago now was we reframed our publishing structure at that point to create a number of new roles for Emerald called Publishing Development Managers. Those are publishing experts, but they don't have a direct commissioning target. Their remit is to get much more broadly into the research ecosystem, aligned with the SDGs to understand the needs of researchers in 4 core goal areas for us, which are healthier lives, fairer society, quality education for all, and responsible management, which are all underpinned by a number of SDGs. It was quite, I think, a brave role for Emerald to launch because there is no immediate commercial return attached to that. There is no commissioning target. It's really about understanding the needs of the researchers and what that means for us as a mission-led organisation to support researchers. So, we're nearly 2 years in now. We've had some great successes with that role, but it's, there's a lot more that we can learn from other people as well. So I'm delighted to be on this panel. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. So, I'd like to start off by asking the panel quite a broad question, and maybe I'll start with Suzanne. And that's, just to give everyone a sense of how your publishing program is covering the SDGs. So, I know, Suzanne, with PLOS, obviously PLOS is mission-driven. You have launched PLOS Public Global Health, PLOS Water, PLOS Sustainability, is it? I can't remember the third one. Yeah. So maybe you could just give us a sense of how the SDGs are sitting into your overall strategy.
I think very centrally, as a mission-driven organisation, the differences I notice in the pre-launch conversations that happen at PLOS versus other places I've worked. That sense, Claire, of consulting the community in a meaningful way about what they want. Do they want a journal in this space? Yeah. What attributes do they want that journal to have? What spaces are not currently being served by existing products in their particular research community? It's not easy to make time for that type of proper consultation. We're all under pressure to do things quickly, and it's an ultra-competitive environment, but I think it's essential to success of these products, and it's not just the commercial success of these products, it's how they contribute on that wider level to progress for something as laudable as the SDGs. So yeah, at PLOS I would say it's central, it's embedded. To hear you say, Claire, that sometimes you have to do things that don't have an immediate commercial return or have a much longer term play towards an eventual commercial return. It's difficult to manage that balance and keep your organisation running in a sustainable way, but there are ways of doing that.
Thank you. I think, one thing for people who don't work in this space, of course, the reason for doing this is for all the good reasons. But actually, if you look at where the publication output is growing, actually a lot of it is around sustainability issues and SDG-related issues. So, PLOS Public Global Health, I think it's published over 500 papers, and it's only been around, when did it launch?
Yeah, so those new journals opened for launch in 2021, and we actually had to bring forward the first planned publication date for global public health because we were inundated with submissions. So yeah, you do your market research in the standard way, right? You see where the research funding is going. You see that there's a potential gap in the market. You know, we're not launching journals willy-nilly with a sole kind of mission focus. They have to be sustainable. But yeah, if you get it right, and I think part of getting it right is not just the breadth of consultation, but who you involve longer term. I mean, the appointment of editors-in-chief, your editorial boards, the type of people you invite to contribute to your front half in terms of commissioned content. It can be more difficult to bring traditionally underrepresented voices into the mix. It can take more time than going to the usual suspects that we might commission in certain subject areas, and you have to factor that into your business plan. But I think global public health is a good example where you can do that and still have a commercially successful product.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to turn to Fabio now, and I just wonder if you could, for those people who aren't aware of the thematic journals that the Nature portfolio has, whether you can, which obviously PLOS Water is a member of, you can just give everyone a bit of an overview of that.
Yeah, so the thematic journal within the Nature portfolio, so within Springer Nature, obviously Nature portfolio is one of the departments, if you like, and it's the group of journals that are conceived in a certain way with independent editors, with professional editors, I should say. And the idea of creating this thematic journal came a few years ago. I think the first one was Nature Climate Change that was launched more than 10 years ago now, I think. So there's been a development of journals that really were looking at we weren't even thinking about SDGs specifically. We were thinking about grand challenges of society, right? So climate change was an obvious one, and from there's been really some internal work of editors together with publishers looking at what were the possibilities of really launching journals that would look at how the natural science with technology and social sciences could be integrated into a single venue to create awareness and to report scientific results towards the solutions of grand challenges. So Nature Sustainability was probably the one that really encompassed all this vision, and it was launched again a few years ago, and it was the first journal to really have a big mission of integrating social sciences with natural sciences. So, and since then we've launched Nature Energy, Nature Human Behavior, and Nature Food, and eventually Nature Water. I'm probably also forgetting something now. But this is, I think, from my perspective, this is really the main purpose. And so the idea that if you look at the grand challenges and the SDGs more specifically, so SDGs have got targets, and each of the target, if you look at them a little bit more in detail, you realize that to achieve that target, you need to integrate natural science with the social aspects. And all these journals are meant to go towards that direction. So not just publishing the natural sciences, which give us a lot of citations, but actually try to create that kind of forum for people just to read, to know, but also to discuss aspects around it.
Perfect, thank you. Julia, I'd like to turn to you if I could. I mean, do you think us as a group of publishers are serving academics' needs appropriately? And I'm thinking not just journals, but books and the wider ecosystem for this kind, not necessarily SDG specific content, but along these themes.
Yeah, thank you, James. I would like to start, thank you, to start answering that question by going back to one of the questions that you started asking when we started preparing for this panel. And one of the first things you said to us, it was like, how can we compete for papers that can address the SDG? And I went, wow, they're competing for us. Like I thought we were competing for getting into the journals. And of course you're competing for good papers because you have to publish and you have to make a profit, make a business, get citation, all these things. But that really made me think that you hold an immense power over the direction that things can take. So the fact that you're even having this reflection today, the fact that you're having this panel, this conversation, for me, it's an extremely good sign of, you're trying to go in the right direction, creating the space for us to do this. And, I'm not surprised when, when Suzanne, you said that you're flooded with submissions, and I heard the same from you last night, Fabio, about the not yet launch on Nature Water. So there is an immense wealth of activity going from us wanting to get into this journal. So the fact that space is not only created in a sort of a static manner, but that you're actually making the effort on trying to direct this in the right direction, I think this is already incredibly positive. Now, going to your second question, how can we do this in a way that it really serves the purposes? And I think this is very important, that we do not get hung up on the SDGs simply as the label of it. As I said at the beginning, for me, the SDG is a political instrument in the sense that it serves to show the agreement at the international level that these things are very important, and these things are globally important. And almost if this gets to this level of agreement, when it's so hard to get agreement on everything from very, very different actors internationally, that on itself sends a very clear message, particularly when we're entering into a new era in which things that were never contested are starting to be contested now, particularly coming from science. So I think having this international agreement on these goals, however imperfect they are, is incredibly important. But my message to you would be, make sure that this doesn't get used just as a label of the thing, that you actually go to what is the impact that matters behind these things. And that is also something for us, for the academics, because it's very easy for us, and I do it myself, I start off my paper saying, what is very important because the UN, blah, blah, SDG, I just put the perks, right? So I start like this, and we all do it, right? But it's very, very important that we maintain the genuinity of this, that we really look into addressing the societal challenge that is behind. And I think in that respect, as editors and publishers, they have a very important role to make sure that we go past that, just the hunger, that, this is water, they put sanitation here, this is good, right? Because it's sanitation. Of course it's good because it's sanitation, but what is the effort that has been done behind, from the research, to actually, push the frontier forward into addressing the actual challenge? I don't know if I have answered. I just wanted to say this. So.
That's okay. That's the purpose of the forum. Claire, could I ask specifically about Emerald? I mean, when you go to Emerald's website, it's clear that the SDGs is the strategy, right? I mean, there's not many publishers that have the SDGs absolutely at the core of what they do. I mean, do you see yourself as an organization having a leadership role, or are you there to be working in partnership with the community? I don't know. How do you position yourself internally? How do you think about it?
I think it's both of those things. I think it's, one of the great things, I think about Emerald is being willing to ask some of the difficult questions sometimes. And, we do a lot of work, things like our Time for Change report, where we had, I think it was 1,400 respondents really raising some kind of very serious issues about where they saw challenges within the research ecosystem and publishing. But we are also incredibly mindful that we can't do any of this on our own. And so it is absolutely about getting out and talking to our stakeholders. I guess a good example of that work is something that we've really been prioritizing recently in terms of our commissioning strategy is looking at underrepresentation of Indigenous voices in the research ecosystem, and it builds on some work that we did a couple of years ago with a partnership called COPL, where we were making some of our content available to students in Indigenous communities. And so we placed a real focus aligned with multiple SDGs this year on highlighting some of the challenges Indigenous communities face, and included things like representation on boards and healthcare issues. But we were incredibly mindful that we could sit as, primarily people in Yorkshire speculating on what we thought the issues were, and it can't work like that. So we went straight out to our editorial stakeholders and we launched a specific advisory board of Indigenous representatives to guide our strategy throughout that process, and we couldn't have done it without them, because we were able to kind of create that relationship up front of trust, and that we wanted to be challenged on what we thought needed to happen versus what they thought. And we had some very honest and robust conversations, and that really affected the way that we launched our marketing campaigns, but our commissioning strategy, what new content outlets will look like for us. And so it's I think we have a role as a publisher, as all publishers do, to be championing what we believe to be right, but we can't do it without those much broader stakeholder groups.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, Suzanne, you earlier talked about the importance for, within an organization of bringing teams together. And we did something similar. We had a hack day around SDG 2, which is around food. So we got members of editorial, publishing, production, marketing, obviously the IT teams together for a hack day, where they were using publicly available data to build a tool within, the space of 6 or 7 hours. And it worked unbelievably well at bringing different organizations or different departments within an organization together to do something that's a bit fun and a bit different. And I think, it's a good example of how we can use the SDGs, not just from an output point of view in terms of what we publish as publishers, but also in terms of building the teams internally. And I think that's, it's very powerful. And I wondered, actually, while we've got you here, Claire, has Emerald done anything similar? I mean, I guess because it's core of what you do, maybe it's just the essence, but you've got some other examples.
No, it absolutely is. And I think, I think we were talking about this a bit yesterday, but, nobody, people get into publishing generally, I think, because they want to make a difference and they believe these issues are important. And so I think framing things around the SDGs is a fantastic way of mobilizing your kind of internal workforce as well. And so, we've done a lot at Emerald, and it's not just about the content that we publish, it's the business of doing publishing kind of from top to bottom, how you exist as a responsible organization. And so we have, I've got lots of colleagues sat down there, but we've got multiple kind of projects and work streams to engage people in, how Emerald operates as an environmental organization, for example. And it's a fantastic way, I think, of helping colleagues, particularly those who aren't directly linked with the content, which is where so much of it happens, across that wider business, feel engaged and that they are working for a purpose-led organization, I guess. And so it is so important.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on earlier about, the risk of being in Yorkshire or London or Manchester or wherever you happen to be, and to be making pronouncements on what's good and right. I mean, how do you go about making sure that the work that you publish is done in an equitable way, both for readers and also for authors? Maybe Suzanne, we'll start with you, and then perhaps Julia, you might like to give your perspective from an academic's point of view.
Yeah, there's lots of different levers you can pull. I mean, coming back to your point earlier about whether we're kind of there to serve or lead, I agree with Claire, it's a combination of those things. I talked before about consulting with the right people. Even finding the right people as a person like sitting in Yorkshire or London can be difficult. And you don't necessarily want to start from scratch at the point where you're thinking about launching a new journal or a new product, for example. So setting up broader relationships between your organization and stakeholder organizations. At PLOS, we're starting to establish some relationships with supranational academic organizations in Africa, for example. And that's really about listening, because we don't know. And we're hearing things about, where researchers in different parts of Africa are on their open access journey, for example, which are a little surprising to us. And so there's a role there for us as publishers to perhaps be more on the training and workshops and listening side of things, rather than here's a new product that we want you to use, because perhaps they're not ready to use that product yet. So I think having those long-term, already established relationships that are based on listening is really important. In terms of leading, I think editorial policies, we regard them as prosaic in a lot of ways. Do these things and you'll get published, but there's a bit of potential for leadership and pushing academic communities to doing things in a better way. PLOS recently implemented I think we call it, excuse me if I get the title wrong, Global Inclusivity in Research Policy, but it's essentially an anti-parachute research or anti-helicopter research policy. And look, we're starting gently. We're not enforcing adherence to this policy. This is about, for those who aren't aware of helicopter or parachute research, essentially where researchers from one part of the world come in to another part of the world, conduct their research, but without really meaningfully involving any local researchers in that project. And so we've implemented a policy at PLOS, which is much more of a conversation with authors about, did you include somebody local? Why did you not include somebody local? Having a conversation about what that may have brought to their research. We'll probably escalate to the point of enforcement at some stage. But I think editorial policies are a way that we can influence that behaviour as well.
So Julia, as an academic, how do you feel about that? I mean, in terms of, both, if there was a mandate around some of these issues, is that going to help galvanise the academic community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say the same concerns that you're having, we have them all the time, both in our research and also in our education. How can we make our education programs more inclusive, from the curriculum, from the recruitment of students, and how that actually translates into our research. So I have recently noticed in Twitter, which I don't use very much, but I noticed this one from PLOS. I think it's exactly what you're referring to, and I particularly noticed something about reflecting that in the authorship statement, and how, I think it's what you're saying about having that conversation, who did what, and whether, this is when you can diagnose that there is no local people, whether there was a meaningful role for them, because very often, you're totally right, this helicopter thing, when the local people are involved, they're involved in data collection because they're the one who have the relation, and those relationships, those knowledge on the ground, the knowledge of the stakeholders on the ground, it has an immense value for the research, particularly for the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary ones. So they actually hold immense power. We go there, we take that capital, and then now at least they get included in papers, but in subsidiary roles. And I think that effort that you're doing in trying to tease out. Now, of course, that is not perfect, because now we have this, some of these journals have statements about who did what. And of course, that can see some power dynamics, saying that, you can manipulate that, but at least it's a very clear effort from your side to try to start disclosing that information. So I praise that. I would say on the first comment that you made, Suzanne, I think it's very important to, when you say you're engaging with stakeholders on this thing, it's very important that you look at initiatives which are already attempting this. For example, just want to give one example which is close to my own area, which is the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Ecosystem Service and Biodiversity. They have just come out of years of a very intense process of making sure that this was, this is around ecosystem services and biodiversity, and around the values that essentially the natural world have for humans. This was very dominated for years from a very Western instrumental utilitarian perspective, which is the tradition on environmental economics, which is one of my fields. And they have made an immense job of trying to acknowledge indigenous knowledge. It was the fight of some countries. This is a government panel, so this is through governments. So some countries, particularly in Peru, Bolivia, but also Southeast Asia, they have made an immense effort to try to make their voices recognized, and they have now published a value assessment. This is just one example, but what I mean is that there is a number of international initiatives that you need to be looking at, because through channeling through these recognized efforts, then you can get access to doing. It's like, I guess what I'm saying, you're not the only ones trying to do this, so there's a lot of efforts of doing this in academia. Make sure that you find alliances at that level.
Perfect, thank you. So we're moving towards the end, and I just wanted to make sure that Claire had an opportunity to tell us all a little bit about the fellows, the SDG Publishers Compact fellows, and I think you're one of 20, maybe, something like that, maybe yes. Not that many, so many. So my understanding is it's almost like a support network, but maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about what the fellows do and how everyone can tap into your knowledge.
Yes, thank you. So the SDG Publishers Compact Fellows were convened by HESI not long after the SDG Publishers Compact was launched, and it was with the idea of, well, we've all signed this thing now. What do we do next with it in terms of actually not just putting our name on a document, but converting that into action? And so the Fellows Group, I think one of the real benefits of the Fellows Group is it's not just publishers talking to other publishers about what they think should happen. We have librarians in there and researchers, and we've just launched a website, which is absolutely worth looking at, and I'm going to forget what it's called now. I think it's sdgfellowscompact.org, but one of my fellows in the audience will correct me if that's wrong. The idea really is to kind of acknowledge that there are multiple publishers who've signed the SDG Publishers Compact. I think one of the great things about it is it's incredibly globally diverse in terms of representation of signatories. but not everybody has the same level of resources or bandwidth to be able to go full on into, you know, lots of activities around SDG work. So our real focus is on creating resources and examples of best practice that can be picked up and used by other publishers anywhere, at any organisation. So on the website, for example, you'll see lots of tip sheets and things about how to work with different stakeholder groups and really embed the SDGs in your publishing programme. But we also have much bigger scale activities. One of the things that we're talking about at the moment is every publisher is measuring their SDG content in different ways. Nobody is using one common taxonomy or classification, and so how do we know if we're making progress, if we're all tracking it differently? And so we have gone out with a survey to the publisher community at the moment just to get a sense of how everybody's doing this right now. What taxonomies are you using? Would you welcome the idea of one taxonomy to end them all? And kind of just to get a baseline of what everybody's up to right now. And the idea after that is that we will start to think about if we were going to work towards a common, what would need to be probably open source classification or taxonomy, how would that even work? It's an enormous project, and so it's only ever going to be achievable if that is multiple stakeholder groups coming together to think about it. No one group can do that in isolation, and so those are the kind of things we're working through at the moment. So I guess my call to everybody is, you know, please go and have a look at what we've got on the site now, because there's, you know, lots of resources on there, but it's very much a work in progress. We meet every week and we welcome guest speakers to come and talk to us about different issues. So we had Nicola, for example, from the Joint Committee for Action on Inclusivity and Diversity come and gave a great presentation to us the other week. And so, yeah, please go and have a look at it. I think it's there for everybody, and so we welcome suggestions for new fellows. So, yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So as we wrap up, I mean, what I'd like to do is ask each of the speakers if we could. I mean, I'm very conscious that it's easy to talk in vague terms about the SDGs, and I think what would be really helpful is to give the audience one piece of advice each on what you've learnt from your activities. So, I mean, Fabio, you're relatively early in your journey, but I'm sure you can share something with the audience.
I think one of the important things for me is that at the end of the day, and it's not really about my experience with this journal, but my experience as an editor, that eventually as journal publishers, journal editors, we work with the academic community. And if we want to start working on really serious SDGs, we have to go beyond that. And that's a difficulty. I'm not saying that I have a solution, but we need to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we want to reach practitioners and policymakers. And to reach out to them is not that simple. We have to do a lot of work for it because they might not have, for example, may not be particularly interested in publishing papers. So how do we interact with them? It requires effort, and requires research, it requires understanding what benefit would they get out of it. And there are ways to do it. I've seen some colleagues of mine, Nature Energy, for example, started publishing policy briefs, which could be of interest for policymakers to read. But, you know, those are small steps, but we have to keep that in mind. That is one thing I would you know, keep in mind for the next few years when I'm working at this journal.
Perfect. Julia.
Yeah, I'm going to take the lead from Fabio there. A lot of social scientists, we work on actually doing that work for you guys. So, you know, make the space, and I know Fabio is doing the space. So actually, on the one hand, we have these scoping exercises that we have done, and then maybe you guys can commission some of this work. So what I mean is that there is expertise there in working with work for our stakeholders, which could be these policymakers, these water managers, these essentially the water professionals that we are working with in transdisciplinary processes, so not just interdisciplinary processes in which you bring two disciplines together, but you bring other strands of knowledge, that is about making the resulting research useful for addressing these specific challenges. So I'm gonna do a little bit of thing here. So let's make sure that the way you engage with social sciences in interdisciplinary processes or transdisciplinary processes is genuine. Don't you just have a little bit of, we're going to do some economic costing of some wastewater treatment plants. Let's really be deep and genuine about the way we do that. And then let's leverage the the value of scoping studies that are being done there for trying to identify the water professional needs, which you're doing anyway. So more of this.
It's harder than what we normally do. It takes longer. It takes more resource. So plan appropriately. Don't expect your usual toolkit to be completely fit for pushing into these areas.
Thank you, Claire.
And I guess building on that, there is so much value that is to be gained if we can kind of combine forces where we can. Every publisher is looking for their own competitive advantage, and that's absolutely right and isn't going to change, but there are many, many opportunities, I think, for us to work together to challenge some of the norms that we're used to in kind of the academic world, thinking particularly about things like incentivization and how supportive that is of interdisciplinary research and applied research and all of the kinds of research that are going to make a change in the world. I think is when we work as a collective across the publishing industry on challenging some of those areas that we're going to have the best effect, I think. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. So we've got a couple of questions come through on the app. Now, I could read them out, but I'd rather do it the old-fashioned way. I don't know if we've got a microphone anywhere. Is there one at the back? Could you go to, Mitu, if you don't mind doing it the old-fashioned way, that'd be great. Yeah, out the front here. And if you could introduce yourself, Mitu, that would be great. I know who you are, but others may not.
Thanks, James. Mitu Lucraft, I'm at TBI Communications. Some of you have already started talking to this point, and I can't remember exactly how I put it on the question, James, but I think a big part of what you've been talking about is the research needs to go beyond that niche community for an individual researcher to really speak to that interdisciplinary piece to other researchers and beyond, so to those communities of policymakers, interested practitioners. How do you do that? How do you engage researchers to think in that interdisciplinary way, and then how do you get that research to those other interested communities?
I can have a go. So I think the type of articles that you publish in your journal are important. Different audiences like to digest content in different ways. So I'm specifically thinking about policy professionals here. The traditional academic research article generally doesn't resonate with policy communities. So I'm sure you're thinking about different article types, Fabio. So policy briefs that some of the nature journals do, I think, are a very good example here. Similarly, traditional marketing strategies, going to the same old lists that we would use are not necessarily going to get this content in front of the right people. So again, we have to go and listen to these communities, the policymakers, and we have to put ourselves into meetings and conferences where we would not traditionally be. I think some of us have been lucky enough to achieve special accreditation for next year's UN water-based conference, so that gives us access to an audience that we would not have traditionally had. So again, it's about thinking outside the box, but not assuming that we know what the answers are outside the box, about talking to the people who know.
And maybe work also in partnerships with the universities in the sense, for example, something that I have the experience and it has worked really well is when, we have produced pieces which have high impact, policy impact, but then for that to be really seen as very credible is because it's backed up by an academic article of the traditional kind, one of the traditional formats. And, that combination of working with the university that is producing the work some of us have already quite a lot of expertise in actually reaching out to the policymaker. Sometimes we actually do the work with and for the policymaker, and then we're going to put our press release. We are going to create the policy briefing, but that policy briefing has a completely different value if it's back up. At the end of it, this is the paper. And some of these policymakers, we tend to sometimes undermine their ability. Some of them are really able to read the paper itself, but even if they cannot read the paper itself, they know that it's backed up by a very reputable publisher. So I think this partnership with the comms, essentially, of the university can be a very useful one.
I think there's a bit of, sorry to butt in again, but there's a bit of work happening on measuring the impact of academic research on policy. And I think that's a very useful feedback loop to keep working on, because if we are showing that the research is having actual impact on policy in terms of being cited in policy documentation, then that's obviously a virtuous feedback loop.
Sorry, I keep I know we've got other questions. I guess just an example of something that we're working on at Emerald at the minute that kind of picks up on what you were just talking about. We're working with Sussex University on a new type of content for us called impact articles, and that's about absolutely that. I think it's about focusing on that impact process from start to finish and sharing the learnings about that impact process as part of that paper. So it includes things about co-creation and working with stakeholders. And I think all of these examples where we can share not just the outcomes, but the steps towards those outcomes are going to be so important.
Okay. We've got one question came in on the app, and that might be Katrina at the back. I can't quite see. But Marios, if we could have a microphone, Marios at the front here, if you could. Thank you.
Hi, Marios Corridos from Nature Portfolio. Thank you for the discussion. One of the problems with the SDGs is the lack of sort of commitment from key stakeholders and ownership. So I guess the question I had was, obviously a lot of the publishers rely on volunteers and goodwill to sort of move towards the SDGs. How do we move from that sort of mode of operation to actually committing and having accountability, at least for the publishers and then for other key stakeholders?
I think it has to come from the board level downwards. I think you have to set strategic objectives at the organisation level that speak to achievement of the SDGs. If something, these days, if something's not kind of quantified as a target for most of us, then it tends to fall down the priority list. So, you know, people at other levels of the organisation need to advocate upwards where they can. You know, if you can advocate for the possibility of something that's going to be beneficial to the organisation in financial terms, as well as progressing the SDGs, and that's always a sensible pitch to pitch upwards. But yeah, I do think it has to come from the top down in terms of quantifiable targets.
But if I can consider it as well, I think I would go back to what Suzanne was talking about before, that we somehow have to find a way to measure the impact. Because then, I guess I'm going to be a bit cynical here, but at the end of the day, one of the few ways we have to measure, maybe the only way we have to measure at the moment success of publications is citations. And because it's an easy way to do it, right? So it's a number that we can look at. If we can find other ways to measure the impact in different ways than with citations that specifically looks at, and I think there are efforts in that sense. There has to be something that is. And this is something, again, that maybe as publishers we could work together to achieve and find ways that we all agree on to measure the impact on SDGs, on policies, and so on. Something that is somehow quantifiable or at least visible to you know.
So Fabio, I mean, if I can just interject, so that's a very good plug for this afternoon's session. So I can see Jonathan and Christina there, and perhaps you and others are around. So there's another session about measurement of the SDGs this afternoon. So if you have an interest in that, please do come along. So they're the only two questions we had in the app. I think it might be Katrina at the back, but yeah. So maybe Susie, you could take the mic over there.
It was just picking up on a point about building capacity, which I think Suzanne mentioned. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the role of the publishers, how much, so many of the publishers are global north publishers and have capital and room for investment. And how much should we be focusing on building capacity to allow those in the global south to create their own means of scholarly communication, publishing their own journals or other platforms, rather than creating de novo journals, for example, about the SDGs, but actually building capacity and training within those countries so that there's more equity in the way that they can communicate what's locally important to them in a way that isn't necessarily, is generally not published in the Western journals.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, but of course we have to be pragmatic about the sustainability of our organisations, but we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. You know, there's a lot happening in the global south that we're not necessarily aware of. So coming back to these relationships, for example, that PLOS is setting up with some supranational organisations in Africa, there's no need for us to present a new product to the global south necessarily. Let's look at what they're doing. Can we help them to distribute what they already have to audiences that they wouldn't normally have access to? I think we have distribution power that they don't necessarily have in their local networks. I think you know, language and translation is an issue here. Not a lot of us invest heavily in that, but I think there's a lot of very good quality content there already in some local publishing programs that the rest of the world, particularly the global north, could benefit from seeing, but they either don't get it in front of them or it's not in a language that they can digest. So yes, we have to be pragmatic, but it's not necessarily about that region or this subject needs a product of the type we already have. Let's see what's there already and see what we can do to amplify the voice that's already there.
I just like to say that I cannot agree more with you. It's really, yes, it's not, let's not increase the divide by creating outlets that are for them. Let us, all of us be us and create, recognize that space. And the same for the theme. I strongly recommend that nobody creates a journal of the SDGs, okay? Because SDG as a label is gonna move on. So yeah, I'm not saying that you're thinking about that, but let's remember that the SDG is the instrument, not the ultimate thing. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? We have a minute or two if need be. Neve at the back. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Neve. I'm the Chief Publishing Officer at PLOS, and I just want to add something to Suzanne's comprehensive answer, because I think there is an additional thing just about the reason for having journals that are coming from those of us who are established publishers that complements journals that are regional and local and hugely important. And we've, you know, as Suzanne has indicated, thought really intentionally about that. And one of the things that we really want to make sure that we're doing is making space for research coming from low-income and low-middle-income countries alongside research from high-income countries, so that it's not trying to replace anything that should be about people having research in venues that are appropriate to their local environment, but it's making sure that research from those communities and from those research groups is also seen by the people who are looking at kind of established journals or have places they already go to look, because I think that amplification is also really important. But as Suzanne you know, has described well, it's not about trying to be a replacement for that. It's about trying to partner and offer something different so that we can help, I hope, to bring that research to a wider audience.
Thank you. So we've got one more question here, if we could, and then we'll so sorry, Susie, this gentleman here. And then at the end of this, you'll be pleased to know you can go for some coffee.
Thanks very much. Jeremy Upton from the University of Edinburgh. I just wondered if you think that a commitment to open is part of your commitment to SDGs.
Yes, obviously. From an open access publisher, I do. It's not just about access to content, it's about access to the ability to publish in these fora. And here I think the business models by which authors access journal publishing are important. You know, doing some work to move away from the APC-based model. I mean, PLOS has a global equity model that applies to our new kind of SDG-based journals, which essentially presents fee-free publishing to people from low and middle income countries. So I think being creative about the money, not just about the article types or the journal distribution, is really important part of inclusivity.
But I'm an editor, I'm not really, I don't know all the details of this, but I think I can talk for Nature Portfolio to say that we are committed to that as well. And it's not, at least, I would say something personal, it's not only just about open access of papers, but I think a lot of effort has to be put also into encourage open data, so open science more generally. And that's something that I think we all are still at the very early stages, but that's something that it should go. We should put priority on that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you all very much to the speaker, especially to Claire for stepping in at short notice. Thank you all very much for your attention. It'd be lovely to speak to you afterwards if you'd like to continue the conversation. But for now, it's time for some coffee. So thank you.